All right. Welcome, everybody, to our second session of Guildify Con here on Saturday. This is the Familiars and Friends panel. We have four amazing authors here that I'm so excited to introduce you guys to. So we're going to start with John, and I'm going to let him introduce himself, share anything he needs to.
My name is John Stovall. I've been an author for basically 2 years, trained by Shammy in the other corner down there. And I write lit RPG and started with Dungeon Core. So that's about all that would be relevant, I think.
All right, Nathan, let's hear from you.
Hey everybody, I'm Nathan Amy. I've been publishing for a few years now. My series that's published is the Fey Nexus trilogy. It's out through Shadow Alley Press. It starts with Black Dawn, and it's kind of a redneck post-apocalypse story set in the Ozark Mountains where I grew up. So that's me in a nutshell. Looking forward to talking about familiars. Next.
All right, Kit.
Hi, I'm Kit Falbo. I'm most known for my crafting of chess books 1 and 2. The crafting series via MMO. I also have a novella and other things. Every time I write something, I feel like I have to complete it. I have to put it up. So I even do poetry. I find it a good exercise for writing.
Nice. All right, Shammy, let's hear from you.
I'm Shammy, like the car cloth, Stovall, and I've been writing for 4 years now, or I've been a published author for 4 years. Technically, I've been writing for much longer than that. Probably the most well known for my Frith Chronicles, which I usually describe to people as Pokemon meets Harry Potter. So I'm definitely neck deep in familiar stories. So excited for the panel.
Hey. Well, we haven't got too many questions yet, so I'm going to start with one that I've already prepped. What is your process for creating the monsters or the familiars that you want to work with? And I think I'm going to start with Kit on this one.
For me, I'm kind of obsessive about craft things. So when I do the familiars, the close companions of the character, you get this advantage with the characters is that their goals are more likely to align with your main character, and you have a closer relationship. So you're basically building a foil character, something that's almost always there. You don't have to develop as much for their own arc and set an example for what their own motivations are that are separate from the main character. So I kind of start with that process, and then I figure out what kind of cute thing inspires me. I like AIs a lot, and since I do a lot of the sci-fi fantasy blend. I do have another novel that I'm working on that has a toad. It's whatever kind of interests me. But I like to design them as the foil for the character.
So let's go with John next.
That would be two very, very different answers for me. I design monsters very differently than I design familiars. When I use a familiar, it's usually because I don't want a personality or role to be occupied by something that would have the same interests as the main character. A lot of people don't want, or if I have a female that I want to be romantically interested in the main character, I might have his companion be a dragon, which is what I did in Elf Empire. If I have a character that's completely ridiculous and threatening people, it's not acceptable in another human, but it is acceptable in a 6-inch weasel. So I tend to, if I have a role that I do not think that I want, but I do not think would be acceptable in human form, I use a familiar or a companion. And Additionally, if I want small roles, as Kit was saying, where I don't want to fully develop a character, just give it a one-off personality and then use cute to cover the difference, I will make a collection of creatures if I needed to do something that would fulfill that role.
Okay. So Nathan, let's hear from you.
Yeah, I think similar to what John was saying, where you have to make some choices why to use a familiar a creature instead of a more humanoid character, but it's still a choice, I think, fundamentally between something that's a force of nature, like familiars are often filling that role and are a relatively straightforward tool, but then you can make the choice to make them more sapient. And in that case, they're filling a role, not so much in the toolkit, but in the party overall. So I'll try to make that choice, like, are they a force of nature? Are they sapient? Or somewhere in between, and try to fit them into the puzzle pieces. There's a guy named Jeffrey Schechter that writes about plays, screenplays, and he has an interesting way of framing party composition that's called the unity of opposites. So you have like thinkers and feelers, believers and doubters, and deflectors and protectors, and those pairs can be the same. Like, you can represent multiple parts of those pairs in the same other character, but if you assign one of those roles to a side character or somebody around your main character, then you get this source of natural tension that is really exciting to play with. So if I want the familiar to be a believer, like maybe dungeon fairies sometimes are the rah-rah types, then that dictates how they talk to the character and how they interact with the world. And they have automatic tension around the other role, which is the doubter, who's always like, no, this is never going to work, or why are you doing it this way? What the hell are you thinking? And you get this dynamic that starts to build. So I think a familiar or a side character can get one of those roles, and it helps me as an author start to settle in their personas. And it helps me write scenes, I think, a little bit better.
Okay. So, Shami, I've heard you talk about this before, so this is kind of one of those questions that I really want to know your perspective, because in your Frith Chronicles, you got a lot of different monsters you've created. So, what is your process?
Well, I guess I agreed with John's statement that monsters are a little different than the familiars, because when I want a monster, I want it to be spoopy. You know, I want the tension to be there because this is something that is meant to raise the tension and the stakes. And it's harder to do with that with like a cute weasel, but it's very, very easy if it's a monstrous, face-eating, deranged Whiteheart. You know, like you're like, oh, that's scary. Obviously, all the characters in my books have a little familiar Eldrin type thing going on, and I agree with Nathan. It's sometimes really fun to pair, you know, the sunshine and grumpy dynamic. One of them's happy all the time, and the other one is not. I agree with John. I think once you start getting to tertiary characters, a lot of those types of characters can kind of be one note because they're there for half of a scene and then they're gone. So it's a lot easier to give them kooky personalities or a personality that's over the top. A personality you would hate if this person was around you all the time, you know, like a weird circus ringmaster who's constantly making sarcastic jokes. That guy's great for 30 seconds. And so if he comes into the scene and he's like, you're like, man, I love that guy. And then he doots his way out of the scene. You're like, I can't wait until he returns. But you would absolutely hate it if the entire novel was just that guy, you know. So I take advantage of that a lot. A lot of the like tertiary characters who also have an Eldrin have a wow, this was a fun personality Eldrin, because it's really easy to do with just one or two sentences. You know, they were menacing or they're very sarcastic. So I really like to take advantage of that. I really like to take advantage too of just having really cool creatures, because really cool creatures again can show up for 2 seconds and you can be like, wow, that's so cool. It's like a two-headed dragon and it's got a sun and a moon theme, and then you clap hard. But then he exits the stage and then we can go to other creatures. It's, I don't know, almost cheating, but just a fun thing. If you've ever played Pokemon or watched Digimon or anything like that, I feel like there's an inherent fun. I mean, Lit RPG offers this a lot. There's an inherent fun in thinking, what if that was my familiar? What if I had a two-headed dragon with a sun and moon theme? Man, I'd be so cool. So it's fun. Adding in lots and lots of creatures, even if they're only there for 2 seconds, adds to that. Well, what if that was my creature? Or what if the bad guy had that creature? And in my world, everybody can get like a true form of their creature, so it can evolve under certain circumstances. So I usually have a lot of fans who message me being like, well, what's the true form of that two-headed dragon? Or what's the true form of that, crazy creature I saw for 2 seconds in that other scene? What's the true form of the ringmaster who's doodling, like that kind of thing. So it's fun to just plant all these seeds of like, oh, it wasn't that cool, and then kind of move on. So I do that a lot. A lot of my process is usually like, how much am I going to see this character of the familiar, I should say. And if the answer is very little, they can be more kooky. And if the answer is I'm going to see them all the time, they need to have a more fleshed out personality. So I spend a lot more time thinking about their dynamic.
It can be a trap too, though, because the kooky ones sometimes are what your readers are locking onto, and they're like, more. And then your narrator starts to hate you.
Yeah, that's exactly what happens. And sometimes, again, if it's too kooky, there's a piece of me that's like, "Hey, guys, I can't have him in every scene. He's too much. He's in at 11. We need him at a 7."
I mean, there's that constant risk of having the side character be more interesting than the main character, and everybody's like, "Why didn't you write a book about the side character instead?"
Absolutely.
Well, I guess that shows how good of an author you are if you can take that side character that you've built in such a beautiful way, and you've got fans that are begging for another series based directly on that side character. So, I mean, that shows how amazing an author you are if you're able to do that. So,
It can be
along.
a character that's hard to tolerate for long periods of time, though. So if you do get stuck with that side character, some level of deepening and transformation subtly needs to happen, I think, to flesh them out, when originally you were like caricature, which everybody latches onto caricatures.
Or maybe
And
dramatically changes, like they get hit by a bus, and now they've got to come to terms with their mortality. And
Sorry,
They go
go on.
because they're sad and their parents died.
yeah, the super, now we're gonna play the sad music as they reveal their tragic backstory.
Jazz, I would never talk about you. Except as a criminal
Just period.
mastermind.
I would never talk.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too.
I almost stopped there. We love you, Jazz.
Okay, so moving on a little bit to the sort of dynamic between the main character and the familiar. Do you build your main character first and then fill in their familiar, or is it the reverse? Do you choose a familiar and then start building in your MC's personality off of how they're going to interact with that familiar? Let's start with Nathan this time.
I only have one series out, so I had to kind of do it one way to begin with. So for that series, definitely the main character came first, because it was kind of self-insert. Where I grew up, I wanted to tell some stories about my family. So it grew from what I knew. The newer series that I'm working on is definitely the other way around. So I think it came party first, and it's less familiar, but side characters, the group really coalesced all together. So either way, definitely in Fey Nexus, I feel like the familiar came along and started to fill a conversational role slowly because she didn't have full sentience or sapience to begin with. And then there was kind of an underlying transformation that was really important to the world as a whole. And the familiar ended up filling that role, which was really cool to see it come together. But it was pretty much made up on the fly. So yeah, main character first in that one, but that familiar developed quite a life of her own.
Okay. Let's go with Kit now.
I pants my novels, so it's not like I do a lot of planning beforehand. I just get like fuzzy ideas, and then I do the begin with the hook character. And oftentimes, when I have a familiar character, assuming that they're not going to get them later on, they really are in that first page or scene. So I always introduce it with some kind of conflict with the main character. You've talked about the grumpy sunshine or just grumpy versus regular. It's always a little bit of a friction or communication between the two that explains both of the character dynamics. So I kind of like do them at the same time almost usually.
Okay. It's very interesting. Shami, what do you think?
I always outline all of my novels, and I have exclusively done it by main character first, then familiar. I like to write a lot of my books in first person. So in first person, the main character's voice is the one doing all the narration. And if I don't have a real strong handle on what that character's voice is, it makes everything very difficult. So I really need to know who the character is. And then I pick the familiar based on the character. So in the Frith Chronicles, Volk is unironically good and wants to be a hero. He wants to be a knight and chivalrous. And so it's really fun to have him have like a fallen knight, like a dark familiar type creature. And that was almost exactly that, if then logical 1-2 step. So I do a lot of, I plan out a lot like that.
I get that. That's a huge part of it. I mean, you got to have a plan. And John.
Well, we're going to run into a problem here. I'm trained by Shami. I just try to emulate what she does for the most part. So the only place I really deviate is I do more Lit RPG and Dungeon Core than she does. And so I think I have a little bit more of thinking about the role within the mechanical party as opposed to the emotional thematic party to a certain degree, but it's still the same basic process. I do tend to mostly outline. And when I do so, I guess probably as a problem in my writing, I tend to think of world first, then main character, then familiars and side characters and the roles that they need to fulfill in order for the main character to go on his journey.
Gotcha. I get that. So we have a question incoming from our dear troll. What are your views on basing characters on people from your life? And I'm not going to choose anyone to start this. Who?
I mean, I stuck my foot in my mouth already with that one. So I try not to. I draw from what I know, but I definitely fictionalize heavily. I feel like there are multiple people in my life who represent the culmination in any given character. Sometimes someone is more dominant than the others, but I think it's important to pick like a palette, like use people you know as a palette to choose from, but definitely then put them in the circumstances in your novel and see how that person might change. And that's exciting. And that's part of the beauty of writing fiction, right? Is you can start to apply stresses that you wouldn't necessarily want in your real world. And that's exciting. So like, how would this person react to this dramatic situation, like an apocalypse or magic becoming available or familiars popping out of the woods and saying, hi, I can talk now, whatever, right? that's all fascinating, and we would all react to it very differently. So you can draw on, I think, real people, and then see
And then
where you
write
can
friend
take them.
fiction.
Yes, friendfic. So that's my feeling on it.
I almost do the reverse. I take fragments of people, as opposed to collections of people. When I make a character, I usually just take a piece of a person and then extrapolate from there. Because if they're a real person, you're probably going to get a character that feels more real. And most of my main characters are also self-inserts, like Nathan was saying, but they're usually self-inserts of the parts of me that I like. But for the familiars, I can usually take the kookier parts. I mean, that's really the if I have a drunk friend and I put it on a dragon, it's more fun than if I put it on a human. That's the best way I could explain the difference there. But I usually just take a fragment of a person.
When I did a bunch of like writing conferences and read a lot of writing blogs or articles talking about how to be a hip to the jive cool author, they said that when you create a character, they should have a demeanor and a goal and a skill set, like these three parts, and that you could mix and match that to make a realistic feeling character. So when I first started writing, I used that a lot, very specifically. Like, so a demeanor could be like somebody who's very brash, and their skill set could be like very skilled or low skilled, and they can have a goal to whatever the goal is for your story, like those types of things. And then you have a fully fleshed out character because they got things going on. I think as I started to write more, I moved more into, I guess, what John is talking about, where I think of a human being that I know really well, and there are certain aspects of them that maybe I combine with somebody else because that might make a more interesting book character, because most human beings that I know maybe wouldn't be the best, protagonist in a story. So don't use that entirely. I do think I know that this is a joke, like basing your villains off people you hate, or like, my ex-boyfriend is now the villain in the story, tee hee. But I find that pretty classless, so I've never done anything like that, except I did use the name of somebody I knew in high school because it was a very silly name. I mean, his real life name is very silly. And everybody knew him as a douchebag. So I used his name for a douchebag style character in one of my books. And I get a chuckle every single time I read it. So, but nobody really knows unless maybe they know me specifically and then know my high school and, that kind of thing. So that's the only time I've ever actually, been like, haha, that guy. But otherwise, yeah, I don't really base off of real life people.
I find that if I'm going to steal character traits and things that I like, I generally do it off of fictional characters or things that I've read or seen in other media more than real life people, So, I don't like borrow names or complete characters from other fictions, but, outside of the Easter eggs, in which then I'm not really matching. So I do like basically. You're right. You borrow what you like from the other media that you consume, and I find that when I'm taking my characters and personality traits, and do I want like a cool rogue from like Scott Lynch's books or something else, I find myself drawn to certain aspects that I like in those.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Like other fictional characters can be ripe material for sure.
Absolutely. So I'm gonna shift it a little bit, but Shami, you had something to say, so go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to insert the joke of, I don't know many ringmaster do people in real life, so obviously I'm basing that more off of, funny media that I've seen. Also, I was just agreeing. Kit has a good point.
Get that. So we want to focus on friends on this as well. So we see in dungeon cores, we tend to see the dungeon fairies and friends of that. What is the thought process when it comes to them? How have you made them unique?
I don't know if unique is the phrase that I would use. I usually have read a lot of Dungeon Core and kind of know where I'm going with it, but the way that I make them, so Shammy has this thing she talks about with like the usually what you're supposed to have is two characters that provide synthesis to be able to talk about ideas for the main character, but with the Dungeon Core you only get one extra character. So I usually try to make them compatible but different from the main character so that they can argue about something or have different viewpoints on something. I usually make one of the characters a lot more risk-taking, one of them a lot more safe and passive and defensive. I usually make the genders opposite, things like that in order to. But it's still the playing off the main character. It's really to give the main character. I mean, I guess it's not just for the main character because we want to be able to have them talk about ideas, have the audience see that and have it feel like a real discussion where people are talking about real things instead of just clapping for each other. But it's not. I guess I never try to make the characters unique, and I have had people complain about that with my work. But I always try to make them real and useful to the story. Those are the two goals that I go for. I don't want anybody to ever think to themselves, "This character wouldn't do that," and I don't ever want anybody to think to themselves, "Why the hell is this character on the screen?" So those are really the, I just try to make them have a purpose in the story of the main character, especially because with the Dungeon Core, that's usually going to be the only other person that they're talking to on a consistent basis.
I think you also have some both like Dungeon Lord style and Dungeon Gem style. Is that true? And do your sidekicks help like with mobility stuff, like to observe the outside world for the Gem style Dungeon Core?
Well, 100% yes, but they're not friends. I guess that's why I wasn't addressing them. They do show the outside world, but they don't usually interact directly with the core. Whereas it's the Dungeon Lord, it's a much more standard, adventuring party and the roles that you would expect to see. But for Dungeon Core specifically, as opposed to Dungeon Lord, the fairy is the only character that they're usually talking to consistently, and I do try to make that a foil. I guess is the best way to say it, is somebody to bounce ideas off of, to have the opposite viewpoint, a voice of reason that's usually not heated, but occasionally has a good point. I guess, yeah.
So, Kit, what's your thought on this?
For friends, I feel that the key thing is that as individual characters, they have their own goals, their own problems, and when you're going through the eyes of the main character, either first person or through close third, you're only catching glimpses of the friend's life. Now, for me, a friend, there's this mutual exchange. So I consider the friends kind of the fulcrum for both some aspects of change, in which the friend is going through something difficult, and that brings realization upon the main character, or or a side quest. The friend has a goal, and the main character is like, "Of course, I'm going to put my stuff down. You've been helping me all along, so let me set some stuff aside and go join you on the side quest to help your goal." And it's kind of try to do that mutual beneficial friendship aspect. It's kind of one of my themes, and as I continuing my chess series, the second book is all about finding and making friends, and as I work on the third book, it's a lot of involved in how do you maintain friendships and help them with their goals while at the same time trying to figure yourself out. So I find that different, using the differences and the different goals is a way to bring about both realizations and side aspects are probably the best use of friends, because sometimes they might leave, sometimes they might die, You don't know what's going to happen as a writer unless you do know, and then you plan it out.
Absolutely. Shami, what do you think?
So with friends, major side characters around the main character, I usually tell people it's based in drama, but when I say that, people get a different idea in their head. And what I mean by that is that there is something dramatic about them that ties them to the main character in an interesting way. So Rivals is a dramatic type of dynamic that I like to see in when I read. I really like when the main character and another character compete, either to be the coolest or to get an item or, maybe to win somebody's favor. The other type of drama is, falling in love or flirting with somebody. I really like when the main character has companions around them that either the companion likes the main character or the main character likes the companion, perhaps both at the same time, although I do think it's funnier when it's only in one direction because I'm awful. But dynamics like that based in drama, because the human drama dynamic is really interesting. And if it's lacking, suddenly it becomes not as interesting. And I usually give the example of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Raphael is usually considered the most favoritist turtle ever, and he's really the only one that ever has drama. He's very angry. He is a rival with Leonardo. He goes off and rides a motorcycle and he's all over the place, and he's too cool for school and he punches everyone in the face. And so a lot of people usually say that Raphael is their favorite, and I think it's because those other three turtles really just are white bread. They don't really have much going on for them. There's a guy who makes jokes and there's a guy who does machines, and the other guy has a whole lot of Japanese honor. So there's not a whole lot to go there. Yeah, nobody likes the size. Nobody likes Raphael's weapons. If Raphael picked up 2 swords, everybody and their mother would be clapping even harder for that guy. But all I'm trying to say is that human drama usually, at least for me as a reader and what I've seen in other people's works, that is usually what people will latch onto and be very interested to see. So a lot of the times my main character has some sort of dramatic dynamic with his companions.
Absolutely. So there was a question from Lars that I fell in love with, but I know that Nathan definitely needs to give his opinion. So please, Nathan.
Well, first I want to piggyback on what Shami was saying for a second, which I think is awesome. It's interesting. So it kind of piqued my thinking about what cozy is, and cozy lacks a lot of that drama that you're talking about. And I think that's one of the tent poles of the cozy genre, is people who don't want to see that or hear about it. And drama is so super subjective that some people are like, oh God, I'm sick of this angst. And other readers like, oh yes, please give me more. So it's an interesting thing to get reactions to drama from readers, because boy, we have such different lenses that we bring to each form of drama, like teenage love angst or interpersonal rivalries or whatever. Like, it's amazing how much that can evoke responses from your readers. So
I thought a
think
lot of
that's
cozy
cool.
had romance. Does it not have
There
romance?
is usually romance, but it doesn't have a lot of tension. There's not a big question, will they, won't they, usually.
Well, that's why I said
Yeah.
it's a little weird when I say drama, because people think like the
Yep.
super angsty kind. I just meant the dynamic, the human dynamic of, oh, I like this person. Do they like me? Oh no.
Yeah.
And whether or not they like me.
Yep. Do you dwell on it? Do you turn it to 11 and dwell on it for chapter after chapter, or do you turn it to like 3 and let it get resolved quickly? I think those are all dials that are really important with the characters. So I love that. That's a good topic. As far as familiars having goals, I definitely think they deserve their own goals. Otherwise, they aren't a source of tension. I probably didn't dig into that enough in my series. I had a pretty, if anything, slightly cozy feeling apocalypse, which is a little weird because my main characters are really close friends that are pretty well aligned, and it's them against the world. So I think that's a different dynamic than, say, a group of people thrown together by circumstance. And the familiar appears in that group in various ways in different stories, right? It can be waiting for the character to appear. It can be thrown in with the character unexpectedly, like unexpected pair bonding or something like that. Or it can be deliberately chased after, like a find familiar spell from a wizard, looking for a compatible companion. And all of those are super valid ways to bring a familiar in. And then once the familiar is a part of the the picture, I think they can either meld in with the main character, especially when they were sought after deliberately, like looking for a match, although that can go very sideways, which is also an awesome source of drama. Or they can, or they can really join with the main character in pursuing the goal. A familiar, when I come back to the unity of opposites idea, I think a familiar often fills the role of the believer in the main character. Even if the main character doubts themselves, they're a source of both wisdom and knowledge about the world, and especially dungeon fairies do that a lot. But also they're a source of confidence when the main character has weakness of resolve. And I think that's a pretty cool way for a familiar to evolve. They may have their own opinion on how the character should accomplish their goals, though, and that is super important, to have a little difference in opinion there to create some more tension and dynamic. And as an author, frankly, it's a great way to cheat, because God, characters talking to themselves all the time sucks. And so they need someone to bounce counter examples or other ideas against to make it flow more naturally, rather than being like a 600-word paragraph about the same stupid debate internal to the character's head, which is garbage. So it's really great to use familiars for those purposes, in my opinion.
Okay. So we'll go to Kit for this one.
I mean, you could do whatever you want. I mean, the joy of being the god creator. Generally, what I do with my familiars is I think of like pets, like dogs and cats, and there's a reliance between the two. There's the way that both the characters' lives and the familiar lives kind of like envelop and meld into each other, which can be valuable plot lines. Like, what do you do when your dog is sick? What do you do when your familiar is sick? What even if they might, like, how do you entertain them? How do they entertain you? It's a much closer relationship. Which, I mean, I haven't like done the old Yeller thing, but one thing that it lets you do is it lets you do a greater sense of loss if you choose to do that later on than, say, friends or even sometimes family, because the familiar is almost always there in the story, because usually they're so linked to the main character that when you do choose to use the tool of loss or pain or worry, that you can, even if they're not full of conflict and constantly trying to use that as the plot thing, you have a greater impact on the reader when you do choose to go in that direction. So I kind of like them more aligned, just so I could like break them apart sometimes.
Absolutely. John, let's go with you.
Every character has a goal. I mean, nothing in existence doesn't have a goal, in my opinion. Even dogs want to be loved and eat. I mean, so it's really just a matter of what role I want them to play in the story, is what goal I give them. Maybe the goal is to be acceptance, because I don't want the character to be driving the story in any real way. I had a weasel familiar that was kicked out of his previous weasel familiar family for being a jerk, and he literally, and yes, it was based off something Shammy did, but anyway, and he's literally a jerk trying to still be accepted. And so he's got a goal, because if he doesn't, what am I even doing with this character? But it's not a goal that's going to control the story. So I don't really think it's a question of whether you give them a goal or not. I think it's a question of to what degree you give them a goal. And that's really driven by the needs of your story. Most of my familiar characters, I made them familiars specifically because I didn't want them to control the narrative to a large degree. So I tend to give them narrower or more easily fulfilled goals.
Gotcha. Nishami.
I mostly agree with John. I do think that, the further away you get from the main character, the less and less you see. The ringmaster comes into the scene for 2 seconds to doot all over the place, does not have crazy goals that I'm going to articulate. But in the Frith Chronicles, when the main character bonds with his familiar has a goal. His old master was murdered, and now he needs to get revenge. So he makes Volk, the main character, promise to help him get revenge. So he has like an articulated goal, and I feel like it's really fun. A story becomes really fun when the goal conflicts with the main character's goal. So in my story, Volk really loves Gregory Ruma. He thinks this guy is amazing. He's his all-time hero, and he gets his familiar, Luther, the Nightmare, and the Nightmare is like, "Hey man, you have to find my old master's murderer. We got to take him down." And Volk is like, "High five, man! I hate murderers. We'll do that." And so Luther is like, "That's great." And then a couple chapters later, it turns out that Gregory Ruma is the murderer. I mean, spoiler alert, but the book's been out for several years. That is fun tension, in my humble opinion. Obviously, I wrote that book, but now the familiar's goal conflicts with the main character's goal because the main character obviously really wanted to be super cool in school with Gregory Ruma, and now he might have to murder him. He tries to convince his familiar that it must be a mistake. We got to investigate more because he really doesn't want to hurt this guy who he thinks is super cool. And so Luther gets his whole subplot, like this whole thing that's going on. We got to investigate murders. Whereas a different character, there's a guy named Adelgis, and he has a cute floating snail familiar that goes into people's dreams and stuff like that. What is the floating snail's goal? That's not really articulated in the book. Now, I know what the goal is. The snail really, really wants to help Adelgis because Adelgis is suffering. He has a creature inside of him that's slowly killing him. And so the little snail wants to make sure Adelgis is okay. But I'm not really going to articulate that a whole bunch because I want the focus of the story to be the main character and his problems, and everybody else's problems are tertiary. I just have to know them as the author. They're not necessarily going to drive the main story, as John said. They're going to be side things that we deal with maybe later. And so I really agreed with John. You as the author, you have to focus the story. And if the focus is going to be Volk, he's going to have all the driving forces, all the main things that are happening. And a lot of his goals are either going to conflict or align with a lot of his buddies so that we can all see, the story that I've crafted together. So, yeah.
And just remember, every time she says she agrees with me, she's agreeing with herself because she trained me. So, except Dungeon Core.
All right, so we've gotten a few questions, and I don't think I'm going to be able to get to all of them, but I'm going to try. I love what Rachel asked. So, if you have both friends and familiars, how do you keep that balance? Like we've talked about, some of the familiars tend to be comic relief, and the friends tend to be that strong and solid and support. But how do you keep that balance? And I think we're going to start with Xiaomi this time.
Well, how I keep the balance is everybody in my world has a familiar, and the role of the familiar is very outlined in the society and culture. The humans have to bond with something in order to get their magic, and depending on what they bond with determines all of their magic. So it's really important. It's a status symbol. And once they get their familiar is always with them. And their familiar grows older by consuming parts of their Arcanist soul. And I have written into my universe that all of the familiars slowly over time gain more and more personality of the person they have bonded with, because they are slowly consuming little bits of their soul. So I wrote into my universe hey, this guy over here, he's a douchebag. And his Phoenix, it's also a douchebag. Whoa, coincidence. So it allows me to have a little bit more characters around that kind of all have, they're like, hey, if you know the Phoenix Arcanist, you kind of know how his Phoenix is rolling around too, because they're very similar. And the people take front and center stage, and they're the ones that usually have more drama, because the creatures themselves are either kept by the society as like a super special thing that we're only going to allow to bond with super special people, or they are like kind of, Luther wants to murder somebody and now he's bonded to the main character. So there are really only those two categories for my familiars. So that's how I handle it.
Kit, how about you?
I mean, as long as the plot keeps on rolling and the conflict and the action and thing keeps on continuing, mostly for friends is that I want them to show up more than just one scene in the book. So I try to work on multiple scenes when somebody's going to be a regular character who they show up. Familiars are more of a just. Sometimes they'll have the familiar like be sleeping during a whole scene, but they're going to be a lot more involved and consistent. So they're just going to be kind of more quiet to the side, while the friends are going to be more active and get like chapters dedicated to their interactions. Usually at least 3. I find that the rule of 3 of having something show up 3 times is a fairly consistent thing to keep something in their mind. If the character's only going to show up once, you need to put a lot less focus on them anyway.
Good. Let's go with Nathan.
I think you balance the familiar a lot like you balance the rest of the party around the main character. There is certainly something unique about the availability of the familiar to the main character, in that they become almost more of an inner voice replacement. As an author, you use them for those, conversational tricks and bouncing ideas without it feeling like it's entirely inner monologue. The interesting part for me was when kind of a slow burn romance was in my books, and when those relationships became closer between the main character and his love interest. I think the familiar can intrude or be more difficult to get space. So you kind of have to deal with that in a different way than just general party balance. And I feel like that's interesting. And they can be in conflict or they can be aligned and allied in helping the main character. So you can do a lot with it. But I feel like a familiar is a pretty intimate relationship built in for the main character, and other relationships that become that intimate are the trickiest to balance around the familiar. What else was I going to say? Oh, you can't entirely forget the familiar. I don't know if anybody reads Order of the Stick, the webcomic, but one of the running trope jokes is that the
Raven
completely forgets the Raven, and then it'll pop into one of the panels. Oh yeah, this remember there's a familiar. So highly recommend that.
What about you, John?
I have nothing to contribute on this question that wasn't said better by somebody else. We'll be better served by moving on to the next question, I think.
Okay, I can appreciate that. I love Jay's question, but part of me wants to hold it back so that it doesn't cover up everybody's face. So the question is, how do you handle growth of an animal companion familiar, as in getting smarter and more sapient, sentient as the story progresses? And do you prefer to keep them basic or evolve them? I think we'll go with Kit on the start of this one.
I mean, I've done both. I have a novel that's going to come out probably next year at some point, or I don't know if I'll find a publisher, do Royal Road or something, in which I have a familiar that is not. It's my toad familiar, so it's like does the toad noises mostly, and as it grows, it suddenly speaks more. So a lot of what I do is it's a communication issue. So it's not necessarily a stupid to begin with. It's just as it evolves, it's able to communicate better its needs and wants. I find whenever you do anything that's increasing intelligence, being stats that increase the main character's intelligence, some magical way to do it, you have a character shift that is kind of rough to handle. That is not always easily digestible by the reader because it shifts personalities. So I find having kind of a good base intelligence, even if you don't like reveal it fully, and then use communication differences as more of the way to show growth.
Absolutely. Let's go with John on this one.
Well, I write lit RPG, which is the crunchy subset of progression fantasy. So if it's not progressing, why am I bothering? To a certain level. So I evolved them wildly. I think one of the very, very few truly unique things I did in Dungeon Core, at least I haven't seen it elsewhere, is that my Dungeon Core fairy, had a stat chart and numbers and managed to help out and power up the dungeon and do things. So I am wildly in the category of evolve everything. I even the animal companions that evolve through other people's powers have levels and capabilities, and I refer to their abilities, growing in relation to what the party level average would be, and give them very specific powers that are based in a system that Sham and I developed over like 15 years and stuff like that. So, yeah, I probably like evolving my things in a way that the Catholic Church might need to know about. Like, I cannot get enough of empowering creatures and talking about their growth paths. I'm wildly on one side of that issue.
I agree so much. Like, goodness, is building the familiars just makes me happy. I guess I'm in the category of love Pokemon and Digimon and all that as well. So Nathan.
Generally speaking, I totally agree, but I do think there's value in having, especially if you're calling it an animal companion, something that represents a force of nature to play with, that doesn't evolve. I wanted a character, so that familiar did evolve. But I can absolutely see the value in like an animalistic presence that you have to struggle with to control and maybe influences your own behavior, especially if you do have some sense of mental bond with something that is ferociously hungry. And you then start to adopt some of that as the main character personality and struggle with that, or embrace it and become closer, even though it's kind of this strange unified goal, right? Changes the main character mentally. I think it was interesting that like the Pern series had such a strong bond between dragons and riders that actually accomplished both in some ways. Certainly animalistic and at times, especially mating, right? Which she didn't get into super specifically, but the dragons influenced their riders in ways, but they were still super intelligent, could hold conversations. So I find that you can use both, right? As an author, you use all the tools in your bag when they're appropriate. But John's right about the genre. We love seeing things grow up and get more complex and evolve. So especially in lit RPG, I would tend toward the progression.
As you can see, I have children, so evolve.
Yeah, I was.
Are they evolving?
It just
Are they bestial?
it just makes everything better to have children.
Yeah.
So Shami.
I have an idea for a book.
Yeah, I have lots of creatures evolving. There's a part of my brain that's clapping constantly whenever something is evolving or changing form, probably deep seated from Pokemon or Digimon, somewhere in there. Nothing is as hype as Digimon mega digivolving into the most badass thing you've ever seen. Guy's got so many guns, and you're like, whoa. So I really love those types of things. I 100% embrace that kind of super fun. Oh shit, they just transformed into something you've never seen in your goddamn life. That kind of hype. I like it when things go to an 11, and I feel like if you have an evolution or dramatic transformation, it's very easy to have it goes to an 11. I have it with all my monsters. I have a crazy corrupted plague in my Frith Chronicles that when a creature gets infected with the plague, it very quickly transforms into a nightmarish type of monster. That's going to an 11, and you're like, whoa. And I really like it when creatures get their true form and they become cool, because that's also going to an 11, because you're like, because it happens like within a couple of seconds as soon as you achieve it. So I love growth. I love dramatic growth. I love cool thematic growth. I mean, I just can't stop clapping. I guess I also like Nathan's comment about forces of nature, because there's like a lot of, I don't know, almost like mysticism style ideas that I've read in books and other things, where there's like an ancient primordial dragon that just sleeps at the core of a world. And you never see that piece of shit evolve or do anything, because he's the most ancient elder thing in that you can even comprehend. And it's really interesting to see that kind of character show up occasionally. So I do like those. I guess more as like tertiary character. Give people who you interact with occasionally. If the main character is going to have a familiar and it's going to grow, it's going to be so crazy. It's going to be so amazing. We're going to high five so many times. So, I guess I balance it by terms of like story arcs. I like to have growth every single story up until we hit that pinnacle, and then whoa, that's the reaction I want from the reader.
Completely. All right, so I do apologize if I didn't get to all of your questions. They were all so good, and I want you guys to ask them. Don't forget, we have the Discord. We have a channel specifically for this panel. So if you have questions, go there and write your comments there. The authors will have a chance to go in there and answer anytime. But I'm gonna give the authors time enough to be able to make some announcements and bring up upcoming projects. So let's start with John. What do you have coming up?
So in a few days, I'm going to be releasing Dryad Dungeon, the first book in that series, although it's technically the third series in my Toth world, and it's closely connected to the Elf Empire series. And then Elf Empire 3 releases on the 8th of November. My Card Noir series will probably release in December. Elf Empire 4 in January. Probably Villain Core 3 in February. So it's going to be a very busy couple months for me. But Dryad Dungeon does have a literal familiar mage in it. So if you're interested in those things, that's something that's there.
Nice. All right, Nathan.
So if you're familiar with Shadowcroft, I'm working on a series that's sort of sideways from the main series called Dungeon Accountants. I'm writing that with Aaron Michael Ritchie, who co-authored the main series with James Hunter. Book 1 is turned in, Book 2 is in edits, Book 3 is fully drafted, so I'm hoping those come out soon. And it's about all these dungeon cores are protecting the Tree of Souls from the evil raiding dungeoneers who are just selfishly sucking up all the apothos. But what about the other dungeon cores who help support those dungeon guardians? There's surely some level of bureaucracy, right? So the Department of Universal Dungeon Efficiency sends auditors to these dungeons to make sure they're doing the job as best they possibly can. Most of those auditors are other dungeon cores who have gems and they can interact with dungeons, but our team are ex-dungeoneers, so they have certain issues when they go into the dungeons who don't necessarily want them there. So Cal and his team, Audit Team 6, are going to go help dungeons be better at their job.
All right, Kit, let's get going.
Right now I'm working on the final book in the chess series. I'm just trying to grind through that while I handle kids. And I have a Maid with Necromancy series that's going to release at some point in the future. I'm still trying to fully process exactly what I want to do with it. I have some options, but right now I really just need to build content within it before I decide of how I'm going to release it. But I really enjoy that, and that has very much close to the Toad Familiar. It has pet battles. It has musical performances. Just everything that floated my boat when I was tickled with it. And that's going to come out eventually.
Nice. I'm excited for that kit so much. And Xiaomi, what do you have? I mean, I know you've recently released something, so tell us all about that.
Yeah, actually, this is a really bizarre period of my career because I released something this week, and in a couple weeks I'll have something else. Because these are all collaborative works. But this is my recent book. Whoa, Blarg, The Half-Life Empire, which is like a Fallout style universe. With power suits and cool post-apocalyptic things. Definitely not a cozy. Nathan's over here being like, I got cozy apocalypse, and I'm like, no, that's not what I got. We got to have the drama up to an 11. The thing that comes out November 1st is the Crown Tournament, which is set in my Arcanist world, but it's all centered around a gigantic tournament where Arcanists fight to win prizes, and I love tournaments, so I can't wait for that type of thing. Yeah, so those are the things that I are releasing right now, and hopefully people are as hyped as I am. I'm jazzercised.
This was an amazing panel. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating. Like, this was one of the ones I was looking forward to so much. So thank you for being here with me. I thank the fans for joining us. We had so many good questions. We want to see you at our next panel. So stick around with us. We love you all.
Thanks, everybody. This was great.